Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners. If I had to pick one book about Uzbekistan that I would recommend to everyone, it would be The Vanishing Generation, Faith and Uprising in Modern Uzbekistan by Bagila Bukharbaeva, an Uzbek journalist and former Associated Press correspondent. Published in 2019, the book takes us back to Uzbekistan in the 1990s and early 2000s, when the newly independent nation was searching for its identity. Islam became an important part of this search. Dozens of local religious groups emerged under the leadership of new religious figures, some of whom developed their own interpretations of the faith. Over time, President Islam Karimov came to see growing religiosity as a threat to both the secular state and his own rule. The oppression of pious Muslims followed, eventually culminating in what came to be known as the Andijan massacre, the violent suppression of protests in the Fergana Valley on May 13, 2005. This week, we revisit those events with Bagila Bukharbaeva, so the author of The Vanishing Generation. We discuss Uzbekistan's turn toward religion, unpack the events that led to the Andijan massacre, and examine whether religion has ever posed a genuine threat in the country. We also talk about Bagila's own experience covering her community, which ultimately led to a years-long ban on her entering Uzbekistan. Before I let you listen to our interview, I have a small announcement. Turan Tales will be taking a summer break throughout July, which means there will be no new episodes during that time. We'll be back in August with more great interviews, stories, and perhaps a few surprises. And one more thing. Keep your fingers crossed for us on July 8th. We'll be in London for the Publishers Podcast Awards ceremony. I really hope that we'll come back with at least one award. And now, welcome to Turan Talks. Hi Bagila, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Very welcome. Thank you for inviting.
In the beginning, I would like to say that I'm a great fan of yours and of your work. I think you're an absolutely amazing journalist, very courageous. And I think that your book about Uzbekistan is the best book about Uzbekistan I've ever read. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, I'm really, really glad that you are with us today.
Thank you for your really, really kind words about me and my book.
So maybe let's start from the very, very beginning of your career as a journalist. So how it happened that an Uzbek girl became a journalist in Karimov's Uzbekistan?
Well, it started a bit before Karimov, I think in perestroika years. My father was a journalist, so journalism as a profession was something known to me, that someone was around working, doing that kind of stuff every day. And then when perestroika started, that was the last few years of my secondary school, when everything started changing so much in the Soviet Union, and all the things that never were told started to be revealed, and everything was all over the media. Television became interesting, newspapers became interesting, everybody wanted to read everything, from first page to the last page, every newspaper. And we subscribed to many magazines and newspapers, and I and my sisters were just taking turns reading everything. So everything was coming out at that time, and I think that was the main inspiration why I decided that, yes, this is something that I would like to do. So I finished school in 1989, so it just was 2 years before the Soviet collapse. So the choice was made, and then the reality changed completely, because there was no more Soviet Union, and then we were left somewhere else, and we had to figure out who we are and what to do with this independence, and what kind of country we are, and then what kind of world we live in, and so many questions. That was very confusing And actually, at that time, I wasn't sure that I would be able to actually do any journalism because we were living in a new country, Uzbekistan. And when the perestroika was happening, all that activity was centered in Russia, in Moscow, all the media and like all the new liberal journalists, big names, they were all there. Everything was coming from there. And we were just like still backwater at the time. Yeah, I didn't know who I could be working for. We were in Uzbekistan and we had to start from scratch, journalism, everything. So that was a big time of uncertainty. Anyway, that's what brought me to journalism.
So, how did it happen that you started working for the Associated Press?
Before Associated Press, I started working for the BBC. It's a monitoring service which they don't do reporting. They just monitor what the local media report and discuss and everything. And based on that, create reports. And so it's like media in Uzbekistan react to this, to that, and everything, how they cover. So. And then in 98, I was in London doing masters in journalism. And then I went back to Uzbekistan and then started working again for the BBC. But in 2001, of course, the 9/11 happened. And then there was the whole world started looking at Afghanistan, where bin Laden was hiding. The Central Asia suddenly came to the spotlight of like international or Western media attention. And then AP needed somebody there based in Uzbekistan. And they called me because like a few years earlier, I just sent them my CV, just kind of throwing it into kind of this into the universe and see what happens. And of course, never heard anything and didn't expect to. But after 9/11, somehow turned out they still had my CV and they contacted me. And that's how I got hired.
So tell me, what was the environment in Uzbekistan at the time, especially for journalists, for people who wanted to ask questions, dig out the truth? Like, was it easy to work as a journalist or was it already problematic? Let's put it this way. Or what was the censorship already so established, like in the later years of Karimov's rule?
The general situation in Uzbekistan was, it was a time of huge vulnerability and uncertainty. And we were left with this leader, Karimov, who had no vision, no ideas how to actually run a country, meaning managing economic and making sure that the population is looked after and things like that. Plus, he was learning how to actually be the leader of an independent country and adjusting to a situation when he has to somehow maintain or keep power, not to lose it. Kind of main problem, unfortunately, for Karimov. So he was very scared and he had no idea how to run a country and he was not sure about like the outside of Uzbekistan, so how to deal with like international relations, or how to deal with Moscow again. He was very like kind of suspicious of all around the country and inside the country. So that's why he went for this isolationist policy. Just didn't want to do anything. Well, like closing the country was, yes, his choice. And plus, internal suppression was another choice. We have to remember also that after the Soviet collapse in neighboring Tajikistan, they started this civil war in 92, like very soon. And Karimov was very scared that it would spill over. And he was also unable to control all the internal processes that were happening, like mentally, or people were kind of searching for their identity, true identity, after like suppression and the Soviet Union, when somebody else tells you what your story is, who you are, and what you want, and everything. So there was this complete vacuum, ideological vacuum, spiritual vacuum, and everything. So it was a very hard place to be and vulnerable, like for the entire country, and having a leader who is not very maybe intellectual or I don't know, in many ways inept. That was, of course, a huge problem for the country. So, in terms of media, of course, there was no media. There were still some Soviet newspapers. They were just carrying on like this inertia. And they were used to being very, mindful of what they report, very like formulaic reporting and everything according to the scripts, according, watching the sense. There is always the censor behind your back and everything. So independent media was non-existent, basically. But of course, Western media started paying attention to at the moment, and they started opening their bureaus, like there was a BBC correspondent and the BBC Uzbek service, and some other news agencies started also paying attention, like Reuters, big, because they wanted to cover this unknown region. So that was the situation. So local media non-existent, but a few Western organizations trying to kind of also do some reporting out of the country. So in a way, when I got the job, I was in a very privileged position to have this protection of this big international news organization. And then I could be much, much more free than the local media. That was a very privileged position. I'm not talking about the limitations of Western journalism at the moment, which is there are many too, especially when they cover foreign countries.
Okay, so you've basically witnessed a growing religiosity in the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it ended up being one of your beats, right, at your work. But at the same time, as a young girl, I mean, I know it from your book, obviously, as a young girl, you already were in touch with people, your neighbors, who also were becoming increasingly religious. So you were basically covering this story as a journalist, but also you were part of this because you were part of the Uzbek society. So tell me, how did the process look like from your perspective? This growing religiosity, this turn to Islam, how did you see it at the time?
Well, I saw all these things happening around me and the people looking more religious, like more Islamic, as it been in a superficial way. Because religion, of course, it's not about external looks. It's not about your beard and whatever you wear. But yes, those external signs were new to us. The whole thing was new to us. And we were such a young society. And after this Soviet bubble, with its certain ideology, which was hammered into our minds all the time from young age, we were completely lost. I'm talking about myself too. We didn't know anything about religion, anything about Islam, anything about the outside world. So I saw these things happening, but I had no clue what exactly was happening. And I wasn't prepared at the time. I had no knowledge to be able to process all that. And that's why mostly I could approach it as a human rights issue without understanding deeply all those undercurrents and how it's all linked. This Islamist radicalization, this quote unquote, where it exactly comes from. So because Karimov started cracking down on them, so the main story became just human rights. And the main story became Islamist radicalization of Uzbekistan as a threat, and then this dictatorship. It was just a very shallow, very stereotypical typed kind of approach to this whole big story, which was unfolding. And I was probably young and unprepared to understand. But when now looking at my book, I kind of tackled the issue from the point or angle which was understandable to me and close to me, because yes, human rights and people's right to worship whatever religion they want. And basically, now when I look at my book, I think, thank you for saying such good words about it. But I feel I did it in that famous story when in a dark room, few people enter and there is an elephant there, and one grabs the tail, one grabs the trunk, and another grabs the leg, and then everyone has a different idea. Yes, what exactly is in the room? So I feel like when I was writing that book but even earlier when reporting on these stories, yes, I was like one of those people in that room. I could only, yes, have this much, to know this much about what was going on exactly in the country. So I think nothing was wrong about people becoming religious. And it was very natural. As I said earlier, we were growing up in this vacuum, ideological vacuum. And this side of the human being, the spiritual side, for me personally, it's the most important thing. And I absolutely think everyone has the right to, yes, to make that journey. But I was wondering what was going on, but I had absolute respect for this religiousness that I was seeing around me. Because even though in the Soviet Union it was suppressed and very much controlled, these religious practices and everything, but I can definitely say I grew up in an Islamic environment and a Muslim community because my grandmother would pray. And her moments of prayer were very serene and beautiful. And I didn't know what was happening. And when we were growing up in the city, but our relatives in Aul or in villages, Islam was still part of their lives. And it was about like sending you off to somewhere, giving you this blessing and praying. And then all those rituals like funerals, weddings, and they made so much more meaning when they included those rituals, which were rooted in Islam. So I could never see Islam as a threat or religion as a threat. So when it all became this like terrorism, I just felt something was off. Something was really, really wrong. How? Of course, now I know much more about how this whole threat was created and whose countries' agendas it was serving and everything. And that was allowed the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and all the mess that is still going on in the Middle East. So now even more, I regret, one thing about my book that it it was an attempt to kind of apologize for the whole religion of Islam on behalf of the religion of Islam, or kind of try to tell people it's not violent, it's good and everything. And I think it's so stupid. We don't have to do it. We don't have to do it. Don't have to apologize for Islam or any other religious practice.
Someone in Uzbekistan once told me that what the Soviet Union did was it taught Uzbeks to pretend very well, that Uzbeks had this like outside face that they were showing to the world, and then another face at home that also included Islam, so that Islam was always there, but just not outside. And what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it just came to the surface. So it wasn't necessarily something that was imposed from the outside. It was something that was always there. But I wonder how you see it from today's perspective. Do you think that some of those groups, because we know what happened, right? We know that the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan did exist. We know that there were terrorist acts in Tashkent. We don't know exactly who really was behind them, because obviously there are loads of theories that maybe it was the security services. But regardless of that, I wonder, do you think that at the time there was a threat of violence coming from Islamist groups, or was it all kind of orchestrated?
Yeah, I think the problem was when there was this big surge of religiousness, so to speak, or this big wave of reclaiming the religion, which was natural. But because we were so in isolation in the Soviet Union from the rest of the Muslim world, so Uzbeks or other Central Asians, They didn't know what was going on outside in the Muslim world. And of course, there are lots of things happening there. And as I mentioned before, because of different political, geopolitical issues or agendas, there were radicalized Islamic groups outside, in the Middle East, and who actually kind of created them and promoted them. That's another issue, but they were there. And these borders open to the Muslim world from Uzbekistan, and then all those different schools and fundamentalists or whatnot, they all start coming into the country. And for completely clueless Uzbeks or Tajiks, it all sounds like, oh yes, this is truly religion, this is how we have to practice. And partially there were some, of course, ideas coming about this militantism, fighting for causes and everything. And that's why the Uzbeks or all young people in Central Asia, they were vulnerable to that kind of recruitment. That was the only problem. It's not because something was like in Uzbekistan ready to radicalize or go wrong. No, but I don't think they represented a real threat, because that was just a part of the process of growing and finding ourselves again and understanding who we are. And it was growing pains. We had to go through we had to go stray in different directions and then maybe realize our mistakes. And I think it's a natural process, especially today when we have all this, the information spreads instantly and everyone has a platform through the social media. So there is if part of the population in Central Asia, like everywhere else in the world, could get radicalized or was prone or vulnerable to radicalization, then there was a majority which wasn't prone to that, and they would push back, and they are pushing back. You can't deny this ability to evolve, think for yourself to Central Asians. They're not stupid. They can see and what's good for them and what's not. And especially now I can see because of the social media that maybe there are still some radical voices or whatever, very conservative preachers, but there are so many who are pushing back and saying, it's not us. We don't want to be like that. And we don't want that all-covering garment. And we don't want all this. Absolute majority, they won't accept it. So I think just Karimov was overreacting because of who he was. But plus, because at the time, there was this big global fight against terrorism. And it was very convenient for Karimov to join that and act as yes, I am too fighting this terrorism. So I think you just needed to give time. One of the characters in my book is this whole family who were my neighbors, Fakhrudinovs, and one of the sons were there. He ended up as a refugee in Sweden because he was in Yemen studying, and his elder brother Ruhidin was one of the most wanted radicalists by the Uzbek government at the time. So for me, it was really a big eye-opener talking to Usman in Sweden when I was working on the book, because I could see this evolution from knowing nothing about Islam, but just wanting some spiritual practice. And then maybe supporting some radical groups, maybe not even supporting, he never was involved in anything. But then it turning into this individual spiritual journey for him. And then I saw that, of course, we can, or any Uzbek can evolve. I just can't see it as a threat. You can't just make this sweeping accusation.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. You write in your book a lot about Birodalral. I can never pronounce it. And it's a group who was later dubbed by the government Akromia. And you spoke to people who were involved in this movement. Can you tell us a little bit more about what they did, how they came into being, and what sort of group it was? Because from what you're describing in your book, the group actually functioned as a cult.
As Birodarlar or Akrami, it's a very interesting case because how one person, charismatic, just comes up with his own ideology and creates quite a large organization. So it was created by Kram Yuldoshev, who first was involved with Hizbut Tahrir group, this secretive, peaceful Islamist organization. But at the same time, he was quite a big fan of Marxism and communism. So in the end, he ended up kind of combining these two ideologies, Islam and communism, in a sense of creating a structure or society in which everything is fairly distributed. Everyone looks after each other, kind of communism, yes. Employers look after their employees, and it's the whole thing. It's a big community where everyone looks after each other. So he started creating this, but also as the ideological foundation, it included some Quranic studies, which Quran interpreted in his own way. So Akram Yuldashev interpreted Quran in his own way and started teaching it to his followers. And because he was so charismatic and intellectual, like in that environment, like cut above the rest intellectually, where he was in the Fergana Valley. So he ended up creating this big network of small businesses which employed families, extended families, and they all were connected. But it was also secretive. They had this hierarchical system of and one person looked after small cell of 4 or 5 people, and then higher and higher. So it's amazing how he was able to create this, but it was a functioning organization and a successful economic model as well. And there was a lot of charity within this group. That's why he was able to create it, because of this traditionally strong family connections in Uzbek society. When extended family is already is one little kind of commune or cooperated, because you help each other and look after each other.
Also sometimes cult-like, right? If we actually...
yeah, of course. So you use that side, like strong family connections, traditional, plus this economic model, small businesses. And because they had this ethical kind of foundation rooted in Islam, moral, they paid their fair wages. There was social protection. Of course, it attracted many people at a time of real uncertainty, when the Soviet system collapsed and people didn't know how to look after themselves and feed their families. That's why I think it worked. So it's fascinating, but ended up very badly because it was seen as a threat.
So what happened exactly?
Eventually, the government, of course, they realized that they knew about their existence. And eventually they decided to go after them. They arrested 20 years, 25 of the leaders who were owners of enterprises. And Kram Yuldashev was already in jail from 98. He was in jail, but the organization carried on. And so the leaders were arrested and then they were tried. But throughout this trial, the supporters were coming and waiting outside the courtroom, and a peaceful protest and everything. So there was tensions were building up as we were approaching to the sentencing day. And then on the eve of that, they just went ahead and stormed the prison, released them, and seized the Andijan administration building. And yes, as I understand, they prepared for that. They had their security wing, and then they got arms from somewhere. They trained themselves in whichever way. I don't know how serious that military training was. Anyway, this is what we had on the night of 12th, 13th of May 2005. And next day, they were all gathered in the main square in front of that building. They had some hostages. There was a big mess, and the city was at a standstill. And but their supporters, I mean, their families, children and women, they were all in the square. And then the Karimov's government started its own operation to put an end to that mutiny, and a lot of people got killed.
You were at the square at the time during the massacre. I know it's probably hard to remember this moment, but maybe you can tell us about how it felt, what you saw, and what really happened there.
Yeah, it was already afternoon, and we arrived in Andijan like around noon from Tashkent. Me and a photographer and my sister and another journalist, four of us, and we were talking to people, trying to find out what's going on. And but then, yes, in the afternoon, this military truck started moving in, and then from all directions, it seemed that this firing started. Yeah, I don't want to go into like all those details, but of course I had to run for my life too. I wasn't able to just, I couldn't stand there and just watching, people dying or fleeing. I just had to run and try to save my life, which I did, but still so like one boy dropping dead with a bullet in his head, and the teenager and an elderly man hit in his hip, and others trying to do something. Yeah, I just took shelter in this kind of in a school which was next to the square, and two or three like boys around there, teenagers, they also were hiding with me and trying to protect me. And then I ended up going, when things subsided a bit later, we sneaked through this park into this local young man's home, and I stayed there for the night, and couldn't sleep, of course. And like 6 in the morning or something early, we went back to the square to see, what happened. And there were lots of bodies there, and road was covered with these bullet shells, huge shells. Yeah, blood, everything. Lost shoes. This is like just, it was like after carnage.
The massacre eventually became a moment that marked a split between Karimov and the West. It marked a turn in Karimov's attitude towards the West, because Karimov did not agree for any independent investigation into what happened. The Uzbek authorities obviously were not interested in disclosing exactly how many people were killed. International observers were not allowed to travel and investigate the issue. And can you tell us a little bit more about what was the atmosphere in Uzbekistan following the Andijan massacre, and why you had to leave the country after all?
It's true, like Karimov was very angry about the Western criticism and the crackdown, and he kicked out the US military base almost immediately on a very short notice. I was already actually living in Almaty. I moved in 2004, so for Andijan I came to do some reporting back to Uzbekistan, and then ended up covering that. So when everything happened, of course, we had to leave Andijan the next day, because the authorities warned us that they couldn't guarantee our security. Of course, they were going to continue their mopping up operations and arrests and everything. And because the city was completely blocked and by the military, they indeed could do anything to us and then blame on terrorists or whatever. So we did leave immediately. And for a while I stayed in Kyrgyzstan, and like on the Kyrgyz side of the Fergana Valley, to cover the refugees. But then I just went back to Kazakhstan. So
Because we have to say that thousands of people left Uzbekistan following the Andijan massacre, and most of them obviously went to Kyrgyzstan because that was the closest country.
Yeah, Kyrgyzstan, they were just fleeing from Andijan all night, going to the border and crossed there, and ended up living in tents there for a few months. And so I wasn't there in Uzbekistan straight after Andijan events.
So how did you learn that you are banned, right? Or how did it happen? Because you're not able to come back afterwards.
Well, I understood that it was best not to go back, not to try going back. But I went back to Uzbekistan in 2011. That was for family reasons and to stay with my family. I was already not doing any journalism. I had left AP by then. So 2011, I was back in Tashkent, but I wasn't doing any research or anything and wasn't trying to talk to people about any issues there. But then in 2012, I went again, but I was deported. I wasn't allowed to enter for reasons I don't know. I don't understand. But anyway, so there was a long break, and after that, they told me they were putting me on this blacklist, so I couldn't come back. But I went to Tashkent finally for the first time after that last year, 2025. Yeah, that was okay.
Okay. And how was it? You probably didn't recognize Tashkent because it's changed so much with all the new buildings and all the flashy skyscrapers.
Yes, it was really strange because it's not the Tashkent that I know, but at the same time, it is still there because I can feel it like through my skin. It's interesting. I can't say that I felt, no, it was emotional in terms of like being back again in my home, my neighborhood, and just looking again out of my childhood room's window. And it was very emotional and good moments. I am glad that I can go back there again, that it's not a closed door anymore, that I can go back and reconnect. Because for me, Tashkent, it's where I grew up. I don't look at it through like a journalist's eyes. Absolutely. And I can just forget politics, forget everything else because everything is temporary. But there are some deeper things, deeper connections, and there is this country and people that they mean a lot to me. So that's the main thing for me.
Tell me, you had a break from journalism, and then in 2019 you published the book. Why did you feel it was important to write this book? What pushed you to writing it?
I decided to leave AP because I felt that format was very limiting, news agency format. And from my experience, I realized that it is so shallow the way you can actually tell stories. And it's just this pressure, competition with the rival agencies and everything. It just felt so quite meaningless. Plus, being not a Westerner, but being local to Central Asia, that was another problem. Writing stories through that Western mass media gaze, which is like you have to always say like former Soviet Republic, autocratic, like dictatorship, blah blah, and everything. And that was it. It's always framed in one way, always. And I just couldn't do that anymore. And then I decided to draw a line. I knew I wasn't going back to reporting journalism, but I just didn't want to walk away from the story. And I felt I had a duty because as this news agency journalist, I was able to cover so little from such a narrow perspective. I wanted to look into it, and it was important for me to understand what exactly was happening. Were those Uzbeks really a threat, terrorists, and all that? And plus, It was very personal because, yes, as I said before, one of the most wanted Islamist, so-called alleged Islamist leaders was my neighbor. Like, we grew up in the same courtyard, seeing each other every day. And I just wanted to understand, basically. That's why I decided to write it.
So, what did you discover when you were reporting for the book? Because you revisited some of the people that you knew from the past. You visited them in the new countries of residence, for example, Sweden. What sort of people, what sort of community you saw, how they changed? Can you sum up or summarize who those people are and where they are today?
So I mainly focused on this group of followers of Imam Nazarev, who was one of the independent preachers who became very popular in Uzbekistan after Soviet collapse. And then he became a target. And then he was hiding for many years in Kazakhstan, and his followers went with him. And then the crackdown was widening and reached them as well, especially after Andijan, because Karimov had much more pretexts and to expand his crackdown. So when they were found out in Chimkent, they fled. They turned to the UN Refugee Agency, and they were eventually, after a long period of waiting and everything, threats and living in hiding for many years, they were eventually relocated to Sweden. They were accepted there. So I went to see them there. What can I say? The core of the group, they remained very close to me. And again, I knew that I was able only to get very little from them. Again, this human rights story about persecution and everything. But questions like their true ideology, things like that, it was hard to get from them because I suspect they didn't know themselves. Exactly. Yeah.
That's interesting.
No, I mean, many of them, they find this leader who just feels appealing. I mean, some things they say ring true to them, and they're looking for some role models. They're looking for some spiritual leaders they follow. They accept what their preacher says or their leader says. Do they process that? Is it a really conscious choice? That's what I'm talking about. Yes. So the group in Sweden, followers of Nazarev, they continued to live as a small, tight-knit community, sticking to each other, still very religious. That was their priority, their practices, their prayers. But I always just wanted to look through all that and see people in them. That's all that mattered to me, actually. And the suffering they experienced and the losses they experienced and all that. But the rest we can't judge. We have no right to judge their choices, religious or spiritual.
I think this is quite clear in your book that you look at them as people, and this is one of the aspects of the book that I really, really liked and appreciated. So if you, my listeners, want to read an amazing book about Uzbekistan, please look up for Bagila's Vanishing Generation. Thank you so much, Bagila. It was a great pleasure, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much for inviting, and I wish you all the best.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.